The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
As we continue in the video Bible reading of the book of Acts, we are picking up in a 29th installment in Acts chapter 9, beginning in verse 36, where we left off in the previous installment, the previous study. We had Peter going around in the region of Judea and visiting churches that existed in that region. He had gone to an area known as Lydda in the plains of Sharon, and there he encountered a man who had been lame, and he healed that man in the name of Jesus. He called on the power and authority of the name of Jesus to heal that man. And that miracle became a basis for a lot of people in that area hearing and believing the gospel and becoming followers of Jesus as well. They turned to the Lord in order to be saved. They believed because of the message that was being proclaimed by Peter in accompaniment with the miracles. So Acts chapter 9, verse 36, reading verses 36 through 43. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas had made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. So there was in Joppa. Joppa was an ancient seaport that had been used by the kingdoms of Judah and Israel in antiquity. It was about 38 miles to the west of Jerusalem. Back in the days of Solomon, when they were building the first temple, the cedars of Lebanon were cut up in Lebanon, modern-day Syria, actually modern-day Lebanon, which is surrounded by Syria. And those cedars then were made into rafts and floated down on the ocean waters, the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, to Joppa. And when they built the second temple, several hundred years later, in the days of the prophets Zechariah and Haggai, in Ezra chapter 3, verse 7, again Ezra mentions, as had been previously mentioned in 2 Chronicles 2:16 regarding Solomon's temple, that the logs were floated from Lebanon down to Joppa. So Joppa was an important seaport for Judea, important seaport for Israel. In fact, it's also the seaport that's mentioned in the story of the prophet Jonah. Jonah chapter 1 in the first couple of verses. When Jonah decided that he did not want to go to Nineveh and preach the gospel there, he instead went to Joppa, which is to say he went in the opposite direction. And from Joppa, he got on a ship to sail out into the Mediterranean to go to Tarshish, which is identified with what we call Spain today. He was intending to go as far as he could possibly go in the opposite direction, away from the Lord's call to go to Nineveh. He did not want to obey the Lord and go preach in Nineveh. The Ninevites were not Israelites. They had no part, as far as he was concerned, in God's promises. They were an alien and hostile people, and he did not want to go and preach to them. And we'll revisit that point a little bit further along, with Joppa being the jumping off point for Jonah's journey of rebellion. There was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas, which if we actually translate that means gazelle. She was full of good works and acts of charity. The woman herself is described as a disciple. This is the one place in the New Testament that the feminine form of the word disciple occurs. But it's instructive because no Jewish rabbi of that era would have called any woman with that language as a disciple. This is common for the saints, to have men and women alike identified as among the disciples of Jesus. But it would have been uncommon in the culture of the day. Jesus had a woman who was his disciple. Tabitha, Aramaic, and Dorcas, Greek, these two terms again mean gazelle. We don't know anything about her age. We don't know anything about her marital status, her family connections, whether she was well off, whether she was just getting by, what she looked like. What we do know is that she was beautiful for what she did. She had the beauty of a good heart, a good spirit, of good deeds, good works. She was full of good works and acts of charity, acts of kindness and compassion. She helped the poor and the needy from her own time, from her own skill, and from her own resources, gave what she had to give to the benefit of others. In those days she became ill and died, it says in verse 37. And when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. And since Lydda was near Joppa, they sent for Peter and asked him to come. The Jews typically practiced burial on the day of death. Now, I understand that the custom was that if they were not in Jerusalem, they could wait as much as 3 days for burial, but the typical practice was to bury a person on the day of death. And so Tabitha's body was prepared for burial. They washed her, got her ready for burial. But the disciples had heard of Peter's activities over in Lydda. Again, this is about 11 miles away from Joppa. So they paused, they placed the body in an upper room, and they sent for Peter. Luke doesn't explain to us exactly why they sent for Peter, but it seems likely that they had some hope that Peter could do something more than merely comforting them, because they knew the power of Jesus. They knew whom they had believed. Joppa today still exists as a community. The town today is called Jaffa, J-A-F-F-A, instead of Joppa. And it's a suburb of the modern town of Tel Aviv, not far from the plains of Sharon. It wasn't difficult to make the journey in a day, that is to go from Joppa to Lydda and back again. A journey of 11 miles, a couple of hours of walking in each direction. And so the disciples came and found Peter and then brought Peter back over with them to Joppa. Peter arose and went with them. He was willing to go where he was needed, and that's going to be important in the next chapter with the events there. He was willing to go where he was needed. He arose and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the upper room where Tabitha's body was laid. And all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics. Now, there are other accounts of funerary gatherings in the New Testament that talk about the wailing that went on. And this isn't that sort of ceremonial thing. This is just genuine grief that's being poured out here. They were weeping and showing Peter tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. So Peter went to Joppa. Maybe he didn't know exactly what was going to happen here. He didn't know just exactly what was being called for. But he went to do what he could, as the disciples requested. They brought him to the body. It seems very likely that they did know what the Spirit had done through Peter previously in Jerusalem, as well as recently over in Lydda. It also seems very likely that they knew that during his ministry, Jesus had raised people from the dead a few times. And also, of course, even in long gone days of Elijah and Elisha, those two prophets had also, on a couple of occasions, raised the dead. At least one time Elijah and at least one time Elisha had raised the dead. Whatever it was that they expected of Peter, they took him to the body in the upper room where the widows were gathered and weeping. Now, this wasn't, again, a carrying on and putting on a show. This was genuine grief, because they were saddened at the departure of someone they cherished, someone who was of high esteem in their lives. We can suppose that the garments that the widows were showing had probably been made for them, that they were among the poor that she had been ministering to. We've had previous reference in the story of the church in Jerusalem to the fact that widows in the ancient Roman world, even in Judea, were often destitute and in need of help. Dorcas or Tabitha had been one who provided that kind of compassionate assistance to people who had no means of reciprocating or paying her back. In verse 40, Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." On the occasions when Jesus raised the dead, at least once when Peter was there, Jesus also put most of the onlookers out of the room. Mark chapter 5, verses 40 and 41. But he didn't put everyone outside. Peter and some of the other disciples were there, as well as some family, before he commanded the dead girl, Jairus' daughter, to arise. On another occasion, Jesus was out on the street when he saw a funeral procession, the son of a widow who had died prematurely. And Jesus on that occasion went up and touched the litter, the bier on which this man was being carried, and commanded him to arise. That story is in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 15. So again, there were a number of public witnesses to what Jesus did on those occasions. And there also had been the raising of Jesus' friend Lazarus in John chapter 11, verses 38 through 44. When Lazarus, Jesus had them roll the stone away from the tomb where Lazarus was buried, and then he commanded Lazarus to come forth. And indeed, Lazarus came forth. Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days at that point in time when Jesus commanded him to come out. But there, once again, were a number of witnesses to exactly what Jesus did on those occasions. And Peter had been present for each one of those 3 times when Jesus is recorded as having raised the dead. But Peter here did something that isn't mentioned in any of those specific accounts of Jesus raising the dead, and that is that Peter, having emptied the room of anyone but himself, knelt down and prayed. Now, the time that Elijah brought a widow's son back to life, he went into an upper room by himself with the body and cried out to God and asked God to restore the boy to life. That's in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 9 through 23. There are differences in detail, but it's a very similar scenario to what we have with Peter. Elijah alone in the room with the dead child and calling on God to do what he would. Similarly, when Elisha once was moved to ask God for the life of a boy who had died, in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 32 through 35, Elisha went into a room by himself with the body, and he prayed and asked the Lord to restore the child's life. So Peter is doing as Elijah and Elisha had done some 900 years earlier in the circumstances where they were called upon to restore the life to one who had died. Peter here draws on the example of Jesus, but more in keeping with Elijah and Elisha in terms of he had faith about the raising of the dead, but he also felt the need to pray for guidance and to seek the power of God. He did not have that power in himself, and so he sought from the Lord. And when he had prayed, he commanded the dead woman to arise, and she did arise. And when she opened her eyes, verse 40, when she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up, and he gave her his hand and raised her up. And calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. Perhaps it would be appropriate to mention here that it was not for Tabitha's benefit, it was not for Dorcas' benefit that Peter raised her from the dead. It was no favor to her to be raised from the dead. It wasn't for her sake. When Elijah and Elisha in their times asked God to raise those 2 dead boys from the dead, in both cases, it was because of concern for the mother who was left without her child. The same was true with Jairus' daughter that Jesus raised. It was for the sake of Jairus and family and not for the sake of the girl who had died. This is explicitly stated in Luke chapter 7 when Jesus raised the widow's son in Nain. Luke chapter 7, verse 13, when the Lord saw her, the widow, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." It was compassion for the bereaved mother in that case, the bereaved father in the case of Jairus, the bereaved widows in the story, the bereaved widow in the story of Elijah, and the bereaved mother in the story of Elisha. It was because of compassion for the bereaved, for those who were grieved, that Jesus was prompted to raise that man from the dead, to raise those others from the dead. It was not concern for the dead, but rather for the living. And so also here. Tabitha had nothing to gain by returning to this world. It was for the sake of those who loved her and were regretful of her death. And we can surmise, although I said that we didn't know anything of her age, she must not have been of advanced years, or I rather doubt that the death would have stirred this kind of feeling. It must have been viewed as a premature death. But Peter did this, as Jesus and Elisha and Elijah before him, because of compassion for the living, not for any betterment of those who had died. And then too, as with the other miracles, including the very recently passed healing of Aeneas over in Lydda, as with other miracles, there was purpose, and that purpose was the testimony that the message of the death, burial, and resurrection is true. The assertion that Jesus is enthroned, that Jesus is reigning, this is true, that he has power, and that power is evidenced through the hands and words of his apostles, including Peter here, and has been since the day of Pentecost onward. So in 942, after Peter had called upon the Lord to raise Tabitha Dorcas from the dead, it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. So again, the affirmation is that the miracles caused people to believe the message of the gospel. Peter stayed many days. And Luke highlights the fact that the home he stayed in, there in Joppa on the seacoast, was that of a tanner named Simon. Now, a tanner would be someone who takes animal hides and turns them into leather. He was a man who produced leather from the skins of dead animals. Now, contact with those dead carcasses would have made him ceremonially unclean again and again, day after day. So this was a very useful skill, a very useful livelihood, but also was a very low-caste occupation among the Jews. They had no admiration for tanners because they were constantly in a condition of being ceremonially unclean, unable to participate in a lot of features of Jewish life. The Jews of the ancient world would not have admired a tanner. Perhaps Peter's own practical experiences as a fisherman on the shore of the Sea of Galilee had helped to prepare him to be a little more open-minded about this sort of thing, to make some concession in this area, to stay in a tanner's house, or perhaps having been taught by the Lord to embrace tax collectors and sinners, Peter was a little better equipped to embrace hospitality extended by Simon the tanner. But whatever the reason, and again, Peter had been bold enough to go among the Samaritans and preach Jesus there and have affirmation of the Spirit that this was indeed the work of God. But Peter was less fastidious, staying and taking the hospitality of Simon the tanner, than many observant Jews would have been. And whatever Peter's thoughts on the matter were, the tanner's house was an appropriate jumping off point for Peter for his next mission. It's going to be a little bit ironic when Peter says shortly in chapter 10 that he's never eaten anything unclean or contaminated, when in fact he's staying in the home of a man who other Jews would view as being unclean and ceremonially defiled. Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10 describes a major turning point in the history of the church and the plan of salvation. Now, it's one that was anticipated from the very beginning, and one that was promised over and over again in the ancient prophets and in the law itself. But the first 9 chapters of Acts describe exciting and vibrant growth for the church as the gospel spread by word of mouth, public preaching, and miraculous confirmation. But that growth is a growth that for every single person who's been recorded as being described as a disciple of Christ, it's either been a Jew or a proselyte to Judaism, someone converted previously to Judaism, or else a Samaritan who also practiced circumcision and kept the moral teachings of the law. Although their ceremonies varied somewhat, they were, by and large, living the same kind of life as the Jews. So here in chapter 10, Luke writes for the first time about Gentiles, about non-Jews becoming disciples of Jesus, without going through the process of becoming Jews in order to become Christians. And this happened through the direct work of the Holy Spirit, using a chosen apostle of Jesus Christ. The church had already gone through a lot of changes in a very short time, but none were so radical as turning to the Gentiles with the message of the gospel. This would have been tremendously unsettling to those who had been Jews all their lives, wherever they lived, but especially those who lived in Judea and Galilee. But the doors of salvation, according to the plan of God, the doors of salvation needed to be opened to everyone. The gospel is for all, as had been foretold in Isaiah chapter 49, where the prophet Isaiah was given a glimpse into the future and the servant whom God would raise up. And there are a number of messianic prophecies in Isaiah chapters 45 and onward, actually chapters 40 through 66, a number of messianic prophecies. This one in Isaiah chapter 49 talks about the servant that the Lord God would choose and raise up to do the work that Israel had failed to do. Isaiah 49 verse 5, the Lord says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." Let me read that again. "I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." So it was God's plan in the days of Isaiah, and for that matter in the days of Abraham, that through Abraham and through his offspring, all nations of the earth would be blessed. That the light of truth would go to the nations. That the servant of God would be a light for the nations and not merely a light for the people of Israel. That God's salvation would reach to the ends of the earth. So the story of Cornelius is central to this theme and to the message of Acts. That this is, and this story, the story of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, which starts in verse 1 and continues all the way into chapter 11 and verse 18. The story of Cornelius is the longest running narrative in the book of Acts. There's no interval, no break here. This is the longest running narrative in the book of Acts. And our attention is brought back again to the story of Cornelius over in chapter 15, when the brethren in Jerusalem are discussing whether non-Jews need to become Jews and keep the law in order to be Christians. But the story of Cornelius is central. It's foundational to what comes after. In Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 8, we are specifically told that Cornelius was a Gentile, and not only a Gentile, but in fact a Roman soldier, a member of the occupying force that kept peace in Judea and that region. Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 8. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God and with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius." And he stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him. And having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. And at Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort. Caesarea was a seaport. Joppa was an old seaport. Caesarea was a new seaport. It was only a few decades old. Caesarea was a seaport that had been constructed by Herod, the one called Herod the Great, some decades before this is taking place in the mid to late 30s AD. Its harbor was not a natural harbor at all. It had been created with cement structures, concrete structures that were poured out into the sea to create a bay, an artificial bay. And the fresh water that was drank in Caesarea, likewise, came through a construction, an aqueduct that Herod had built from the mountains to bring water down to Caesarea. This town that was built in an inhospitable location was named in honor of Herod's patron and friend, the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus. Caesarea, named for Caesar Augustus. It was a regional capital, sometimes occupied by Herod's heirs, and sometimes later by Roman governors. And as such, there was a Roman occupying force there in Caesarea, the keepers of the Roman peace. And this man named Cornelius was an officer in that Roman force. Generally, a centurion we would think of as being a commander of about 100 soldiers, and he was a member of a cohort, one of 6 commanders. A cohort consisted basically of 6 centuries, 600 soldiers more or less, and each cohort had 6 centurions, each of them commanding 100 of the men. The centurions, historically we know centurions were well paid. As officers, they had good compensation. A centurion received about 5 times as much as a typical Roman soldier, a typical legionnaire, and they had social status and comforts to match their income and their authority. And we don't have any specific historical information about this cohort, the Italian cohort in which Cornelius served, just the historical fact that that's the cohort in which he served. Acts chapter 10, verse 2 tells us that this centurion was a devout man, a man who feared God with all his household, and gave alms generously to the people and prayed continually to God. Describing Cornelius as a devout man who feared God tells us that he embraced much that was taught in the law and the prophets. He followed the teachings of Moses in terms of morality and various principles, but he had not converted to Judaism. This description is reserved for those who were not converts to Judaism. We'll see others later in Acts who are similarly described as being devout and God-fearers among the nations, not converts to Judaism, but people who listened in the synagogues, who learned of the teachings of the law, and who followed with fear the God of Israel without becoming Jews. The centurion at Capernaum that Jesus had been asked to heal his servant in Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 would have fit into the same category. He was not a Jew, but he asked Jesus and showed great faith in Jesus and in God. Remember that prayers and alms, Cornelius is mentioned here as being one who was generous in his alms and constant in his prayers. Remember that prayers and alms means gifts to the poor, are linked together as being acts of righteousness in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, back in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 15, when he said, "Don't do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them." And as acts of righteousness, he specifically mentioned prayers and giving to the poor, prayers and alms, the same two things we have here. We know that Cornelius had a family and he had servants. He had a household that shared his devotion to the God of Israel. And Cornelius, like Dorcas, in Acts chapter 9, verse 36, was rich in good deeds. He was a man of constant prayer. He had no organized system of worship, no revelation, no pattern other than the law of Moses and the prophets, which were read and taught in the synagogues. He had no means of reconciliation to God, no priesthood or sacrificial ritual, but he could listen when the scriptures were read. He could listen to the teaching in the synagogues, and he could be generous, and he could pray along with his family. In Acts 10 and 3, we continue about the 9th hour of the day. He saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius." Back in Acts chapter 3 and verse 1, we had the report of Peter and John going to the temple at the 9th hour, the same time of day, which was the hour of prayer. We know that Cornelius, although not a Jew, being a devout man, observed the Jewish custom of praying at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We know he was praying because when he describes his own vision in Acts chapter 10, verse 30, when Peter comes to his house, as we'll get to in the next session here, he describes his own vision and says he was praying when the angel appeared to him in Acts chapter 10, verse 30. So it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour of prayer, and he is praying when the angel appears. And he stared at the angel in terror, the ESV says. He stared in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial to God." Cornelius' reaction to the angel, his terror, is similar to the reactions of a number of people in the scriptures when encountered by an angel in some kind of splendor, some kind of magnificent appearance. Confronted by the divine presence, the guards at Jesus' tomb, if guards watching over the tomb of Jesus, and when the angel appeared and rolled away the stone, they became like dead men because of what they saw there. Like Saul approaching Damascus, Cornelius knew that he was dealing with awesome authority. Now, Saul had an experience with the Lord. Cornelius had an experience with an angel. Those two things are different. But both of them knew that they were dealing with someone of great power and authority, and rightly addressed the one speaking to them as Lord. When Jesus taught about appropriate alms and prayers, he said they needed to come from the heart and not be for show. He said in Matthew 6 and 4 and Matthew 6 and 6 that the Father sees and will reward you when you do these things from the heart in an appropriate way. And Cornelius here is receiving a just recompense for what he has done. He has had no specific means of approaching God, just what he has defined for himself, refined from the teachings of the law and the prophets in the Old Testament. When the angel says to Cornelius that his prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God, that's putting him, or rather putting his prayers and alms into the category of a type of offering. This has been a sacrificial offering coming before the Lord. It's a type of offering that Israel made on the altar, in the tabernacle and in the temple, a memorial portion described as perhaps a handful of flour with some oil and some frankincense which was to be burned on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. That's mentioned in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 2, again Leviticus 2 and 9, again Leviticus 2:16, and onward through the description of the various sacrifices and offerings that the Israelites were to make to God. A memorial portion. Your alms and your prayers have come up before God as a memorial. So these have been received as a sacrifice coming before God. He's a Gentile. He's a member of the non-Jewish nations, a man who has no Jewish heritage. But his offerings to God, which were a pleasing aroma, were the good works that he did and the prayers that he prayed. And we'll pick up the instruction that the angel gave to Cornelius next time, in our next video, beginning in Acts chapter 5, with what the Lord, through the angel, told Cornelius to do. Acts 10:5 next time.